Welcome to the Veriff Voices podcast, a collection of conversations with leaders from across the industry, sharing tips and valuable insight into shaping the future of online identity. This podcast is brought to you by the people of Veriff, rebuilding trust in the digital world.
Hello everybody, and welcome to this episode of Veriff Voices, the podcast where we talk about fraud, compliance, tech, and everything related to identity verification. My name is Chris Hubert, and I'm Director of Creative and Content here at Veriff. And today I'm delighted to be joined by Hubert. Hubert is our VP of Engineering here at Veriff and is an expert in all things automation and the systems that make Veriff what it is. So Hubert, welcome and thank you for joining us first of all. But would you just like to start off by giving us a little bit of intro as to sort of who you are, your background and experience, and what brought you to Veriff in the first place?
It's a great pleasure to talk to you today. Look, my background, I'm French and I'm an engineer at heart, software engineer. My career actually is fairly simple to explain if you take an helicopter view. I started as an IC. I started coding actually fairly early at 10 and I just knew straight away that would be a big part of my life. So I was an individual contributor in various companies until I started having this regular push toward leadership role. So I did what sometime in engineering we call the pendulum, where I became an individual contributor again after being a manager and back. And then at some point I realized I would do the switch, and it was at Sky in the UK. And in the end I realized after a couple of years, well actually almost 10 years, leading big team, that's all I knew, like very big companies. But because I was an entrepreneurial in my career for an adventure that actually didn't last, I had this really big desire to go back to something like this. And here I am. It's been 2-3 years that I've been working on SaaS, much smaller companies, really targeting growth. And I love it. And actually, for me, it's a sweet spot being strategic, but close to people and really trying to move the lines of what technology can do in this world.
That's a fascinating story. And so based on that background there, Hubert, what is it about Veriff that kind of attracted you to join the company in the first place?
So the first thing to say about Veriff, and that's really important to me, is it's product-led. And I really insist on this because I've come over the years to realize that there is really only one way to do engineering well, and is to do it in a product-led fashion, to really solve people's problem, to really have this iterative approach to shaping a solution that can be really mature and scale. So that's one thing. The second thing is Veriff sells technology. So I've been in very different kind of companies, and sometimes, the technology is just a mean, but at Veriff, it's very close to an end. It's not, of course, the ultimate end, but it has this. And at Veriff, it has also this component that is fascinating, which is AI. We do a lot. So for me, when I saw this condition, I was already very intrigued. And then as I met the people of Veriff, that's when I got sold. And I really wanted to join that team for all these reasons.
That's really interesting. And you mentioned there, Hubert, about that AI approach. And you've talked about that sort of the broader technology, I suppose, that goes around it. What is the business problems that you see Veriff actually sort of solving with that technology?
It's the business problem of engaging the market, the customers, in a way that's digital and yet with high level of trust. And that's very interesting because, as we know, I mean, you speak about the market, about the financial market, like the underpinning property that makes it work is trust, right? And it's true, the digital world. It's so funny because, we've been working, all of us, in companies that wanted to be digital first and then wanted to, in the early days, it was, let's have a website and then, let's have an e-commerce platform. There were all this, and I think now we're going to the real problems. It's not using this digital world as a way to optimize and, and be 24/7 and all these things. Now it's about really using this cyber world as a platform for really having a real part of our lives to take place there. And suddenly, the fact that this digital world removes so many barriers and so many even signals that I'm using in the real world to use, like how do I maintain a high level of trust? And again, it's the fuel of, the financial part of it, the long-term relationship part of it. So, I find like even if with solutions like Veriff, we move the plot forward, the biggest part is still ahead. Like this is not a solved problem.
That's really interesting. You touched a little bit there on the subject of trust, and that's something I'd like to explore a little bit more, if that's okay. You and I had a conversation a little while ago where you were talking about what you called the identity crisis online, which I thought was a really interesting phrase, actually. And that's sort of leading into how individuals trust each other. Would you mind just elaborating on what you mean by that term identity crisis, and then sort of exploring where trust can go from there, I suppose?
Well, you can look at it from many angles, but fundamentally, what we're saying is online today on most platforms, I don't know who I'm dealing with, right? So the first issue is again this ability to kind of and an interesting angle to it. I find even if you look at platforms like social media, Twitter, and the likes, etc. I was reading a really interesting article. It was, I think, 2 months ago, where effectively what the point that was made, a scientist making it, the first time actually that the internet create condition for which dark behaviors in human beings are only rewarded, and there is no downside of, for instance, being a psychopath online, and so what we're trying to say, it's not just like, do I know who you are? It's like, are we creating environments where actually normal behaviors and virtuous behaviors are actually still operating in the same way as we are used to have them? But so that's kind of the marketplace element, the interaction online. From an individual perspective, I'm sure, we all have the same life, and if you step back a bit, it's really weird. Like, we have all these passwords and emails, and sometimes you have to decide, like, do I go on this platform using my Google account as my ID, or do you? And it's like, it feels like Stone Age, and actually we're all meant to use different passwords and renew these passwords every 6 months or so, but it's unmanageable, right? There is no, so from an individual perspective, it's really weird. If you add the family perspective, I'm a dad, I have 6 children. Now I want to help my children enter this online world, but I have no tools either. And actually, I'm so surprised that we have all these Android, iOS platforms, but as a dad, they don't help me at all. And how to start connecting or allow some supervision of an identity and protect. And then, of course, for companies, like, it's such I think have made good progress with GDPR, COPPA, and the likes, but the companies that are operating more and more online, they also need to take a lot more responsibility into protecting the data, using an identity when it's required or not. So it's such a multifaceted problem, but that's what I mean by the identity crisis. Is how do we create an environment where actually protection is there, but the barrier to entry and the ability to engage is still convenient, but also where we can scale this to kind of go into different dimensions of life and of online life.
Yeah, it's clearly a really big problem, isn't it? And I think lots of people are obviously trying to solve it. And you touched on it there with some of the companies that you mentioned, taking some level of responsibility here. Are there kind of practical steps that you see companies taking or platforms taking? Or are there things that you see as sort of good practice that other companies should be following? Or are these things kind of very much still evolving?
It sounds abstract, but you say you're a big retailer. What is the identity for you of your customers, right, or your prospect? And it's already being very informed about what is it. And because, for instance, I'll give you an example that I think I can share from Sky. Sky had an interesting concept of identity where on one side you need to be able to log in as an online user, but then, for instance, you can interact with Sky through different accounts, right? And it's really interesting. But at the end of the day, there was a flow in this design, which was, okay, one individual can have multiple accounts, but only the individual has an identity. But suddenly, across the entire spectrum of interaction between Sky and its customers, no one could tell you, are we talking to an individual in this flow, or are we talking to an account? And so already the concept of identity can be quite sophisticated and very different from one company to the other. And you need to be deliberate about what is this identity? Why do you need it? What data do you attach to it? What is their sensitivity, right? So that's the first thing. And so now we started having better tools, but if I'm honest, I think we talk a lot about them, but we don't really use them, like data governance and even very, big corporate companies, sometimes even fairly technically savvy, I don't think have fully cracked this concept. But then the other thing is trying to also create an ecosystem that goes just beyond their unique needs with their online platform, to create a convenience that can scale for so I don't want to create a different password for every single website I can go onto these days. And I think actually it's tricky because, of course, once you start owning the standards of the ecosystem, like, there are lots of powers at play, and everyone wants their share. But on the other side, like, there is such an avenue for conversion, for just if you create this convenience and this ecosystem, suddenly, like, you create a space where evolving into it safely becomes actually the lowest barrier to entry, and then you could just create a lot of synergies here. I'd say that the last part is also accepting that there is a demand. So, and we see it, and of course Veriff is at the forefront here, is like there is a need for excellence here. Like you can't start handling, and sometimes it's also accepting that it's not a problem you can solve on your own. Like for instance, doing great with even account management or even just password. Like I remember, I think it was 10 years ago, we started in the engineering community, we started thinking like, please don't generate and store password yourself. Like if you can use already a proven implementation of it, it's better. If you can not even have to do any of it because you can rely on something else, even better, because there is so many ways of shooting yourself in the foot here. And so I think there is an interesting point to be made that there are players that are emerging, and I would say Veriff is definitely one of them, that kind of package this expertise in a unique way and maintain it at the right level, because of course there is a big fight in this space. Like it's never achieved, always to be improved.
Just to pick up on something there, that just to sort of expand on if we can, you sort of said the industry some years ago was talking about passwords and encouraging best practice and that kind of thing. Do you feel that engineering has enough of a voice generally in the market? I mean, it's something, I guess the question, to phrase it another way, is that do you think engineering should have more of a voice, or is it more one of those behind the scenes, kind of the brains of the operation?
And that's where I will actually go back to the product leadership element, right? We want to be product led at Veriff, and many more companies now, of course, embrace this way. And I think that's a way to say, and the way I look at it from Veriff is very interesting, because the product role is really about creating almost a conversations across many skill sets. And at Veriff, it's very prominent because in more, you could say, traditional companies, when they have the product function and they are product led, they tend to create a balance between what the customer wants and what engineering can deliver. Sometimes you have a concept of data that's coming in there, but at Veriff it's already all of this plus data science plus market expertise. So really there is a big forum to be facilitated by the product role. And of course, in that context, I think it's quite important to listen to the engineering voice. And why is that? So the first thing is there is a lot of complexity. As I was saying before, it's very techy what we do in this space, right? It's pure technology. Like product people at Veriff, they need to understand what is an API, how do you design it, how you manage your scalability. So there is very big background everyone needs to have. And in the engineer in that regards is always the reference, is the top expertise. And then the other thing is, it's so interesting what's happening these days, because of course we keep pushing the limits of what's possible with technology. And that's very important. Partly if you're in such a techie and such intense environment, it's like you need to know what's possible, for instance, on an attack level, and you need to what's possible on customer experience or just scalability level. So suddenly you can't just discard you can't even ideate without an engineer kind of helping you navigate these lines of possibilities. And the last thing to say is actually, it's not just about ideating and then talking, and the voice of engineers is hands-on, right? So prototyping, and experimenting. And again, here the product approach is great because we do discovery, but it's actually about practicing and trying and failing. And so all of this is what makes this engineering voice. And it's true, that's actually, you were asking me before, what attracted me to Veriff is like, I'm not in a place where engineering is this, this team at the end of the corridor on the left, and we don't go there. Actually, there are no windows. They just speak a different language. Engineering in a context like ours is very much the heart, and so here I would almost say the engineering voice becomes a responsibility. We need to be articulate. We need to provide clarity, and we need to also take proactivity very seriously. Again, it's the product role is very important to facilitate, but the product at the end of the day is as strong as any of these voices can make themselves, right?
I love all this. That's absolutely fantastic. Thank you. And I think these insights are absolutely superb, actually. I'm going to take you down another slightly more narrow route on this, if that's okay. I want to think about really what sort of engineering at Veriff, I suppose. I think you've kind of touched on this in various ways already, but I think the sort of question I want to get into is if you're considering a new product, for example, or a new sort of piece of engineering, what are the factors that need to be considered And how do you sort of think around this before you actually go into sort of the launch process and the build process and so on?
Yeah, so that's a very good point. And again, here the product role actually really spearhead the effort. But in the end, there is a strong need to understand to go into a discovery phase. And the discovery phase doesn't necessarily always have a lot of engineering in it, but at Veriff it tends to have it. And then what's interesting for us is, so before we start, usually what we need is, surprisingly maybe, it's data. And then the other thing that we need from an engineering perspective is an ability to rapidly iterate. So there is already, and that's why for us it's very so important to have this technical ecosystem that we keep building that allow us to easily bring data into the scope, but also really allow us to kind of quickly iterate on our solution and test it sometime even by going live and bringing some use case onto it, etc. And so the for me as a manager, what it means as well is that it's really important that the teams, and again, it's not just engineers, but has autonomy as well. Because there is no point in having this well-oiled machinery to kind of iterate if actually there are organizational blockers, right? So when we start, we actually look at all of this. Like, do we have the data? Do we know how to iterate? But do we know how to create the right level of autonomy for this group of people? And then, it's worth really engaging.
That's really interesting. Yeah, and I think to sort of sum that up, I suppose, would I be correct in saying then that really what you're doing is kind of empowering your teams to make sure they have the right tools and the right abilities to make the right decisions, I suppose. And then that process of iteration with the right sort of data, they're the sort of the ingredients that need to come together for an effective delivery of the right type of technology.
Yeah, I think it's a good way of putting it. And so this empowerment, you have it at the problem statement level, like they need to be able to calibrate this problem based on, so it's not just we know what we need to solve, it's like there is this discovery is both to figure what problem is solving and what solution makes it well solved. And then it's the empowerment is, as you exactly said, like having the right tooling and the right ability to operate. And then the latest empowerment I could refer to is like being able also to kind of provide even to senior management like options for moving into the direction of this initiative. And again, a product-led approach really makes sense, because suddenly when you do that, you're customer centric, and if you see that the market, the customers are expecting certain outcomes or a certain direction.
No, I think that's a really good point. And I think that some of us are, and certainly I'm guilty of this, are kind of are guilty of thinking of sort of engineering as these incredibly talented people, but sort of operating in a little bit of their own bubbles to a certain extent. I get the feeling that with you and the way that you work here at Veriff, that actually there's an awful lot of interaction with other teams. There's a lot more collaboration. So I'd really be sort of interested to sort of how that kind of manifests itself, and specifically kind of what teams do you find yourself working with the most?
So in engineering, we work really with lots of teams. Of course, so we've mentioned it a lot now. So product is really, actually, we don't even consider ourselves to be separate teams, but they definitely have roles that put them slightly out there. But in the day-to-day of Veriff, we collaborate a lot, maybe surprisingly, with our revenue organization. Because we are so focused on the enterprise market and we are an enterprise player, the way we approach these customers is by bringing engineering really close, partly at the beginning of the life cycle for them, to make sure that we can calibrate our solution, we can operate a level of testing. But also they tend to have special needs, these players. So we also need to kind of be very responsive at this stage to understand what makes them special in their flow and in their relationship to identity, etc., and be able to provide the adaptation to our products in a timely fashion. So revenue is actually also, we see ourselves as a strong partner to revenue. But then interestingly enough, at Veriff, we have also a big emphasis on legal and compliance. So because that's actually what we sell as well. And so we actually have very frequent interaction to make sure that the way we get recertified, the way we kind of handle our data, etc., is always in line with all the expectations we have on Veriff. And actually at Veriff, one thing we did that is not always implemented like this is we have embedded the data function within engineering, because here again it's so intense, I would say, that the data team really belongs to engineering at Veriff. It's a natural match. But it's actually to show that we interact like deeply, and both ways. Actually, it's not just we need the data team to give us access to data. The capabilities they need are very technical and much more than the usual like BI stack that you find elsewhere. So it just makes sense like this.
You talked about obviously internally working with the revenue team, for example, and also revenue generating teams, and understanding the customer requirements directly from the source, I suppose. The market itself and the world we live in is changing very rapidly, obviously, and tech has to sort of try and, the tech we have has to sort of keep up with that, I guess, and also lead the way to a certain extent. So how do you keep yourself up to date? How are you to sort of stay aware of all the different things that are going on in a broad sort of market sense?
That's a good question. Right now, if I'm honest, I still feel I'm learning. I've been in this industry for 6-7 months. The way I do it right now is actually I'm still, when you start a new job, you take a lot of notes and then you go back to them. And so I'm for my industry knowledge, I'm still in this mode. So for instance, 2 months ago, I started being engaged in a conversation about a certification called EIDAS, and I didn't know about it. So suddenly I started, reading. It's a bit like reading Wikipedia, if I'm honest. Like you start threads and you kind of drill down into it. So compliance and certification has been one side of it, but now I'm really interested in understanding a bit better, not really the competition, but what innovation is happening here. So how AI is used, both, again, to what kind of fraud is used for with GenAI, for instance, and understand also what GenAI is doing to the solution side of things in our field. So I go a bit where the wind pushes me, to be honest. But it's about being curious right now and just building this kind of mental map of all the concepts and all the players we have in this industry, and making sure I actually understand what's what. And I'm dying to get a bit better on this kind of veneer, because I have a couple of topics that I'd like to go much deeper into. It's about the data architecture that we need to have to kind of really go beyond what's possible today, and so embracing much more real time and having still the ability to protect the data, and I think there are a lot of things here that are possible now but haven't been exploited properly. And another one is trying to understand what is the concept of operational excellence applied to a system like Veriff, like the capabilities we have, the IDV space, because it's not the only industry that should go through this transformation, but right now operational excellence still mean we are up and running. But there is a next question is like, but okay, we are up and running, but are we delivering the level of quality that we need, right? So in our world, for instance, our level of accuracy, our level of automation, our critical aspect, our critical failure rate, and right now they are part of the quality of our product, but they are not part of something that we can respond real time on and really be proactive about as much as I like it to be.
No, that's great. And just sort of taking you down the route, I get, you touched on AI before and generative AI specifically. How do you think that AI and machine learning technologies in general will sort of enhance engineering in the future? Are they, in fact, are they an enhancement, or do you see them more as a risk? I mean, what's your sort of view on this?
I think actually engineering is no different, but maybe many didn't see coming that GenAI actually would have such an impact on the way we do engineering nowadays. But it's already happening. So funny how, the funny thing with engineers is we do welcome new technology and we do embrace it fairly easily. But I would actually tell you I would be very tempted to be able to be an IC again for another 6 months, because I would like to try for myself. But we see at Veriff already some of the changes have already happened. So one of them is so we use some of the solutions that are like assistive coding solution, you could say. We use GenAI to generate some of the code, or even ask the AI questions, because the AI today has read all the documentation of all the technical solutions of the world, right? Which is quite fascinating. So even if you integrate with a very arcane API, you can actually already ask questions and get samples of code that does just that, etc. Which also transforms the way we approach our own documentation at Veriff as well, because if actually the AI can read our code and understand it, then maybe the documentation we need to produce on top of it doesn't need to be a full-blown text. So we are really exploring a few things here. But the truth, what I'm trying to say is, it's shifting the work, but it's not actually for now. We haven't replaced entire role with it. Like if we have optimized, and I think it will continue like this. I actually don't think I don't envisage, at least for the next few years, that we wouldn't need an iOS engineer, we wouldn't need a data scientist, we don't need a front-end engineer anymore. Maybe what it will do, for instance, is we've been, when I was younger, we didn't have front-end and back-end. Like we were just doing everything in the very early days, and then we started specializing people because just the stack was becoming too complex. And then, in the recent years, we've been back to talking about full stack engineer, T-shaped engineer. And I wonder if actually that will not be supported by AI to kind of allow this level of complexity that the stack we have now to be actually still something that one person can handle, again, because of the assistance we get from AI. And also for me, what's important with AI and the future, it's also this concept of knowledge. Actually, I'm that part, I'll confess, I don't know where it's going, because you don't have the knowledge. You don't need anymore to have the knowledge in your head. Even for 5 minutes, like we could say internet helped a lot because now you just click and you get to the knowledge. But you still load it in your brain, and then you need to do something with it. Maybe you have a problem to solve, etc. But now the knowledge doesn't travel in your head anymore. You get almost a solution straight away. And so for me, the big question I have is about creativity. Like, I think you need to have this knowledge in your brain so that creativity can happen. Or are we going to outsource the creativity almost entirely to the machine? And I don't think so. I think actually even the word creativity only makes sense. I mean, now we're going a bit philosophical, but I think human beings needs to be creative. Like an engineer would tell you, it's a highly creative activity, software engineering. So I think there'll be a line somewhere where actually the machine will do, but the creative element will mean that the knowledge we'll still have things to learn as engineer. We'll still have to. So that part I'm definitely keeping an eye out, but it's not just for engineers for me. I'm looking at it from the angle of being a dad and looking at what education system should be for my children, etc.
That's like an amazing glimpse into the future there. I love that. And it'll be really interesting to see how this evolves over the coming years and even months, actually. I think it's such a fast-moving world. So we're just sort of coming to the end of the conversation here. I just want to sort of go back to one final question, really. I just sort of just you as a person who obviously a Frenchman. You've lived in England. You're now living in Spain. There's obviously a lot of sort of cultural differences when it comes to things like leadership methods and so on. So what have you noticed? What are the differences about being in those sort of parts of the world? And has this sort of experience brought a different angle to your world, to your life, to your outlook, to your style of leadership and so on?
Yeah, it's true that actually I will add to the list of countries Estonia, because actually one of my biggest cultural challenge has been to start at Veriff, but I'll come to that in a minute. So yes, it's very interesting because it does shape you and it does require you to adapt a lot. So I started actually my career in Paris, and here, clearly I was, a proper product of the French educational system, so could adapt easily to this market to an extent, actually, because I left also the country because there was, long story short, is someone who is a doer in the French working culture is necessarily receiving instruction and not making too many decisions. So, and software engineering in particular is a very disturbing concept in this mindset, because, we've seen it so many times now, but software engineer can be a CEO. A lone person can start a full business, right? So it's a very challenging for top-down culture. But anyway, then I went to Switzerland. Actually, I worked 7 years over there, and here I would say, the cliche actually works okay. Like there is a great discipline. So great ambition could be as a manager, and I learned to become a manager first in Switzerland. There is a concept of clarity that was important, and actually I have struggled a lot with it, and I had to learn a lot. But then you also, maybe a bit cliche, but the concept of creativity and improvising and, crisis mode was also something I realized that my leadership needs to really almost compensate. Like here, I can't expect always the same level of initiative. But it's a bit of a cliche. Of course, there are a lot of nuances. When I went to the UK, I struggled because I was told, probably because I was working for Amazon, and I was told, like, your style is too conversational, which initially for me, I felt this word, I like conversations. I thought it was actually a compliment, but then I realized, no, in the American culture, it is not. But I also learned that the concept of accountability is not like culture has something to say about how you enjoy accountability, how you manage accountability. For some people, it's an opportunity. For some other people, it's risk-taking, and they can be risk-adverse towards it. So I think in the UK, I really learned that there are different things, and you need to work a bit with the grain. Like you need to. So that was an interesting thing for me. Spain, I guess, coming from what I said about Switzerland, what was refreshing for me is that it's back to Latin, after Switzerland and the UK. So there was something about connecting with people that was much easier, maybe because, again, I'm also from Latin roots. And there is also sometimes actually a reputation that's not fair in the cliche, which there is actually a lot of hardworking people. Like, it's a hardworking culture. But it's true that, for instance, the ability to follow a process, that's true. Like it's hardworking, but it's not necessarily like process oriented or something like this. But then improvising is also much easier, and actually it's something I struggle sometimes at Veriff, because sometimes I can be 2-3 minutes late. Actually, today I definitely delivered on this with you. 2-3 minutes late is not a problem in Spain. Actually, being completely on time maybe it has something to do with luck as well, because the traffic, the way the public transport work, I don't know, right? So there is this tolerance, there is this relationship to time that's also fairly different. And it's true, then I started with Veriff, which is headquartered in Tallinn, as we know. And yeah, if I'm honest, this is the first time where I felt actually culture was a challenge, not because there is anything difficult, but for instance, one of the struggles I had is I felt that there was an expectation sometimes that, as being the most senior leader in engineering, I should be more top-down, more directional. And I couldn't be sure, right? But I sensed that there was the disappointment that I wasn't really the leader that was expected. So actually, I tell you what I did this time, because I felt there was a challenge. I actually read a book, and I really recommend this book. It's called The Culture Map by Erin Meyer. And it's a fantastic book, and it's actually very quick read, but it's actually break down culture around 8 scales and allows you to understand a bit. And again, you should always be careful with generalization, but it definitely helped me to understand a bit how I should reposition myself. And again, be me, but also be a me that's really easy to understand and easy to engage in the context of a culture that's more from the Baltics.
That's great. Thank you so much, Hubert. I've loved this conversation. It's been a real pleasure. I think it's been absolutely incredible to sort of hear your insights on this. There's some really, really great takeaways that we can, that I'm sure all our listeners will be sort of clinging on to. So thank you very much for your time today. I'm sure we'll talk again. I think there's so much covered here. I think, AI in itself is something that probably we could lean into for a podcast all by itself. So we'll definitely have you on again if that's okay with you. So thank you for joining us, and thank you everybody for listening.